Well, this season, we've been considering ways in our lives that we can seek God. And just a couple of weeks ago, we heard a bit about the story of Job and how, in times of grief and fear, it's okay and even important to cry out in lament. And if Job is the story where Job has to quote the children's book about Alexander, has the terrible, horrible, no good, very bad life, the story of Ruth is a very similar story, only from the viewpoint of a couple of women. We don't tend to think of Ruth's story that way. Part of it is even, often read at weddings. But indeed, what we have is a very tragic family story. Let me remind you. Once upon a time, there was a family, Naomi and Elimelech, and their two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. And their crops fail so significantly that they need to pack up whatever belongings they could carry and move away from their home in Bethlehem to Moab. We tell that part in a couple of sentences, and we don't think very much about how hard that would have been. I don't know how many of us have ever had the misfortune of having to pick up our lives and move because we can't afford to stay where we are. But maybe you have felt forced to move for other reasons. Changing health or life circumstances required you to find a new place to live. And these are difficult and challenging experiences to go through. Unfortunately, there are literally millions of people in our world today who have had this experience. We cavalierly speak of immigration and refugee policies without remembering that we are talking about actual people, and without considering what it must be like to be forced to relocate, to be forced to leave home. The book of Ruth begins in the days when the judges ruled. And in Christian Bibles, the book of Judges comes right before the book of Ruth. And if you read through the book of Judges, it's kind of a hard read. It chronicles horrific social conditions, idolatry, and disastrous civil war, and a famine that gripped the land. So in a move of desperation, probably with the hope that it might be temporary, this family moves to Moab, hoping for better prospects. Well, not long after they make this huge move and they arrive in this new home, the dad, Elimelech, dies. And Naomi and her sons must carry on without him in this new land where he was supposed to be the main source of their security. And we don't know how, it doesn't say, but they find a way to survive. And both boys grow up to manhood and marry local women named Orpah and Ruth, who is the namesake for the story. Now, Naomi may have felt mixed feelings about this. To bring Moabite women into the family would not have been her first choice. Certainly would not have been looked upon favorably by anybody else in her family. On the other hand, marriage would bring the prospect of children who could care for her in her old age, continue the family line. That was part of the way that they could survive together. But just 10 years later, both Mahlon and Chilion die. And who is left in this makeshift family but 3 widows from different cultures who now none of them have any children? Widowhood was tough in ancient times, not just because of the emotional burden of loss following the loved ones, but also because in a patriarchal society, it frequently left women without any way to support themselves. So that's why all the prophets often remind people of Israel of their duty to care for widows and orphans. It was a difficult way to live. So you can see, kind of like Job, this family experiences more than their fair share of tragedy. And isn't that sometimes the way? I expect you can think of circumstances, maybe it's been your own experience, where it's just one bad thing after another, after another, after another. A really bad week, a really bad year or a few years. It's how things just seem to happen. And in truth, it does happen to all of us. Hopefully not in the extreme way we see with Naomi's family, with one blow after another, but isn't sorrow part of life? And sometimes we're tempted to compare our suffering, aren't we? We're discouraged, we're sad, we're in pain, and we look at other people's experience to see how it matches. And sometimes we look and say, well, I guess I don't really have anything to complain about compared to people living in Ukraine or Afghanistan, for example, or people who've had this kind of loss or that sort of loss. And indeed, sometimes it is useful to give ourselves that sense of perspective. And yet, the issue with ranking our suffering is that then we don't give ourselves and others permission to feel. We end up judging our or other people's level of suffering, whether they should or should not feel sad anymore, whether we should feel angry or sad. And the truth is, when you hurt, you hurt. Your pain is real. Your loss is real. And your suffering should not separate you, but rather connect you to everybody else who is feeling that same sense of loss, to the experiences of Job or Naomi or Ruth. Now, the book of Job is popular in the Bible because that story wrestles with the question of why. Why do these bad things happen? The book of Ruth doesn't ask why. Ruth's story is about what we do when the world is falling apart around us, when we are grieving our losses. And you can imagine that with the death of her husband and her sons, Naomi must have felt there was nothing left for her in Moab. And so when she hears that the famine has lifted at home, she determines that the best thing for her to do is to go back to Bethlehem. And at first, her daughters-in-law, plan to go with her. Despite their cultural differences, it sounds like Orpah and Ruth and Naomi have become quite close in these 10 or so years they've known each other. But then, Naomi, maybe knowing the challenge that it is of leaving your home and going to another country, says, you know what? It would be better for you, Ruth and Orpah, to go back to your families. You go back home too. You will have people there who can look after you. You can start over. You're young enough, you can maybe remarry. I have no other sons. I can't provide you with husbands, as was the tradition back then. And I'm certainly too old to find another husband to look after us. You can hear in her tone that she is discouraged, she's frustrated, she is resigned. The Bible even tells us that she is bitter. I think there is much uncertainty and grief and frustration in our world today. Political anxiety related to the upcoming US election and political divisions here at home. Deep-rooted conflicts and wars around the globe. Violence in our own community. The fears and frustrations with regards to climate change and the grief of loss due to natural disasters or unexpected storm damages. Money problems, unemployment, work stress, loneliness, bullying, difficult relationships. And then we too experience the losses of those we have loved. And if we are feeling today any grief or anger or frustration, if we feel resigned, burdened by the unfairness of it all, Naomi meets us exactly where we are. One of the pieces of good news in the book of Ruth is that blessings can still come even when we are in the midst of grief, in the throes of our anger or frustration. Naomi is kind of determined to be alone in her grief, isn't she? And while she does eventually convince Orpah of the wisdom of turning back to her homeland, Ruth will not be similarly convinced. Ruth promises to go with Naomi, to stay with her, to convert to her religion, to make Naomi's people and Naomi's God her own, even to die and be buried wherever Naomi goes. She knows she may not return to Moab ever again. Ruth is in it for the long haul. And even as it may be what she needs, it is far from clear that Naomi is happy about it or happy with Ruth. All we hear in this story is, after that, Naomi said no more to her. Indeed, the rest of chapter 1 suggests that Naomi continues to take solitary refuge in her pain. Pain is not easily overcome, is it? And nor is it easily shared, even by those with the best of intentions and with comparable pain. Ruth, too, after all, is now a widow who loved Naomi's son. I wonder if you can relate to any of that. Perhaps you know the insecurity you feel about reaching out to someone after something terrible has happened to them. Do they want to hear from you? Do they welcome your interruption into their tragedy? Should you phone? Should you go? I wonder if what we see in Naomi's story is that no matter how much we want to retreat from one another in these difficult times, so that the only way we're going to find our way is if we do so together. That we need to accept the reaching out of those around us. That we need to continue to reach out to those who are in grief, even if we're not sure how to do it or whether it's wanted, which requires quite a bit of commitment, as Ruth's actions remind us. The journey of grief is kind of long and kind of hard. Dr. Alan Wolfelt writes a lot about grief. He stresses that one of our key needs in mourning is to receive and accept support from friends, family members, neighbors, and colleagues. The empathy of others allows us to express our natural and necessary grief outside ourselves. Whenever we talk about our grief and share our stories of loss and love, we're taking a step towards healing. We need people, not simply to comfort us in our loneliness, but also because these are the relationships that give our lives meaning. So even if we're introverted or stubbornly independent, developing or strengthening a relationship with even one other person can help us through a time of grief and enrich our lives in untold ways. These are the people who give us an experience of God. So as we follow through Naomi and Ruth's story, we see the ways that Ruth's support and commitment is vital to their survival. We see the slow progress of living life after grief, and how important it is to both of them that they're not alone. Their decision to stick together through grief blesses them both. and it turns out, changes the whole course of history. Eventually, you see, Ruth marries a relative of Naomi's named Boaz. And Naomi gets a grandchild after all, a child who would become the grandfather of King David. Who knew? When we travel the road together, blessings can happen, even to those who feel like they are having a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad life. And for this we say, thanks be to God. Amen.